So, so I think we get Norm Brown is on. This is John McNutt speaking, and we've got a couple of folks on. So I'm going to run through this in 35, 45 minutes, and feel free to. You might have to speak up, or I'll try to pause when I gotta get through a section in case there's any questions to deal with. So you should be seeing on your screen the MASA logo. Um, and I'm going to just kind of run through now. Some of you may have picked up parts of this before, but so MASA stands for Mutual Agricultural Software Alliance. And the purpose of MASA is to, what this is done, it is a closely held limited liability company that is set up to own and continuously develop production agricultural oriented enterprise resource planning systems. So we realized when we kind of got started in this whole process that ERP is a kind of a popular term at the moment, and we realize that FBS systems has been an ERP for quite a while, but that what we really want to do with the whole MASA plan is to build out a database that'll link financial, production, and other important information into a common database that will support accounting and management needs for farms and ranches. And it's designed for farms and ranches. And MASA is owned and controlled by production agricultural firms who will utilize this Ag ERP to operate and manage their farms and ranches. MASA is being developed on the foundation of FBS systems. And MASA completely intends to interactively work with allied organizations and other companies, people like potentially Conservice and others, and to interact and work with banking institutions, financial institutions. So it's an inclusive, not an exclusive mindset as we go into this. So we're in phase one. Phase one started January 1 of this year, and we are asking, and your participation on this call, we're asking and we're developing Class A unit ownership. Class A owners are farms and ranchers or people that are closely affiliated with data and data analysis companies. They have contributed in either capital or sweat equity $25,000, and they are the owners. Those Class A unit owners are the owners. And we have intentionally designed it to date that one class of ownership gets one vote. As part of this process, MASA has developed a licensing arrangement with FBS, basically, excuse me, I jumped forward there, FBS for the intellectual property. And in the term sheet, which is the details of this offering, there is a copy of that agreement between FBS Systems and MASA. In exchange for that, FBS Systems Norm has received one Class A and 9 Class C ownership units. Now the Class A is the only voting unit, and the Class C units are equity units. But what that does is that gives FBS Systems a real big stake in the game in the success of MASA, because they have for FBS to get value out of this process, MASA has to be successful. So we're utilizing and working with FBS to really work through this phase one of this process. And I think we're all getting a little more comfortable with some of the terminology, but really in a sense what MASA is doing in phase one and working with FBS, one of the things we're doing is paying what's called technical debt. Well, we are helping the code that Norm and his crew has developed over the last multiple decades to update to the ability to work in the seamlessly in the cloud, to be able to work seamlessly mobile, and to deal with and correct and enhance the code as we deal with some of the legacy issues that exist because FPS has been around for decades. So that's really going on in phase one, and that's happening right now. As part of that, FPS has moved from the farm office into the town of Aledo, where we can have better internet connections. And we have been hiring additional coders who are working with under the basically the supervision of and actually they're employees of FPS, and MASA is contracting with FPS to take this capital that's being raised in this in the ownership in the buy-in to MASA and use it to bring to do this coding improvements in the original FPS code. Now, it's really important to understand that if you become a MASA member, you no longer acquire or access your code or your code license through FPS. From that point of being a MASA member, you then access that code through MASA. MASA owns that code. It's a joint development agreement with FPS. So that takes us into phase two, but phase one is likely to last about 30 to 40 months, of which we've gotten about 6 months under our belt. And during that kind of phase one period, because we're trying to make this as seamlessly as possible for FPS members who are either continue to be FPS members or become MASA members, everybody's got to keep running their code and keep their data up to date during the process. During phase one, FPS's code and MASA's code are identical. But at the end of phase one, there will be some separation, and MASA board and Norm is still discussing what this all means. But at the end of phase one and moving into phase two, the code will begin to deviate. I think we fully intend to make sure that FPS has a viable code and has the ability for an introduction for people to come in and get started in an FPS system, but we really want them to be able to grow into the MASA camp. And so if they are larger operations and they have multiple entities and they are requiring more sophisticated uses of the code, over time, we're going to try to really make sure that's really moved up into MASA and FPS stays in the more straightforward utilization. So with that, over time, even the code that FPS will sell just the very kind of straightforward level, FPS will then start paying MASA a royalty for the use of that code that's being improved with the MASA capital now. And it's important to recognize too that the contract today between MASA and FPS is a cost-only contract. So the money, all the money that MASA is putting into the thing is directly going into enhancing the code. You see in the kind of blue circle there where it says pending, we are actually having a number of discussions with what we're calling at this point Class B or allied members. These would be other organizations that have a inherent interest in developing good general ledger information, makes a solid financial database of which to bring in other applications. And so we are having some of those discussions, and the MASA board and the MASA membership has not fully decided what that allied relationship will look like, but we are working on doing that. So let's see, any questions on the slide that's on the screen? So as we move into phase two, and we'll have to, first off, we'll have to kind of see what makes the most amount of sense as to which alternative, or there's probably alternative C's and D's out there also. But MASA potentially, at this stage, MASA is very lean organization. It has a 7-member board, but everything is being done as a contractual relationship with FBS as far as the work getting done. But there's nothing stops MASA at some point from developing its own staff, and having some kind of working relationship with FBS. Potentially MASA may be a buyer of FBS. Potentially FBS can figure out and maybe head off in its own direction at some point. But right now that's all kind of waiting to see how things develop. We're really taking a pretty active effort not to think that we have this is all figured out, and we're going to try to figure out some of this stuff as we start to get a better feel for what the market's asking of us. So if you request the term sheet, we will send that, Norm, or I will send that to you. It has the information in it about the offering, which includes the operating agreement for MASA, and it includes the intellectual property agreement between MASA and FBS. And then there's just some things that have to be signed and checked off. We're only offering, the offering is only going to qualified investors, which are people and who have actually, in this case, it's existing businesses of substantial asset base underneath them, and that's what it's being offered to. On the screen right now there's 17 members of MASA currently, and there's a number of others that we are talking to right now. But in addition to what's on the screen is FBS, is of course a member of MASA. You see there a mix of grain and livestock operations and some pure grain operations, a number of fairly large livestock operations, and also a mix of more, I would say, more classic family style operations in Iowa and Missouri and around the country, who actually really see the importance of data and utilization of that in making management decisions. One of the kind of side benefits of a MASA ownership is working with a group of companies that are focused on data and focus on data utilization. So as we develop, and we're doing this right now, as we prioritize development of MASA and the work with FBS, we have a really strong sounding board, and hopefully a lot of direction will be provided over time as we figure out how we want to develop the MASA code into the future and the things that we're building with. Remember, in the name, it's a mutual association. It's a mutual association of a group of companies that are focused on getting to the same point in the future. Part of when we started, if you look at just a little history of us getting started, a number of these companies had looked at FBS, and they are all existing FBS users, and they looked at FBS as it currently is configured, and they thought, well, what's the future going to bring? How do we ensure that we have a database and a general ledger and a financial control system that will span generations into the future? And so it made a lot of sense to them to look at doing something from a mutual basis as opposed to everybody trying to do something on their own. And that, I think, may be in the long term one of the greatest strengths of MASA, because at the farm level, financial database systems really helps individual farms be competitive, but there really is the development of these database systems. They really are not competitive with each other at that level, and so it's one of those mutual activities that makes a lot of sense. You'll see Latta Harris, who I am with, is an accounting firm, and the reason we got involved is because we have a number of clients who are FBS users. We have several of the current MASA members who are Latta Harris clients. We see that a database system, a control of the financial information, how critical it is to the success of operations. So we lent our support into developing this on behalf of our clients, and actually the MASA kind of members are people that we see that we have a lot of things in common with. Any questions? Comments?
No.
So ownership units, that's as the Class A units, voting right and membership meetings, equity rights, subject to user fees and capital costs. I think that's important to bring up. So there's 25,000, but there will be an investment cost, ongoing investment cost to build out the code as we see it. The nice thing about it is if we do this together, it's, we get more bang for our buck as we bring in additional members. And not only when we bring in additional MASA members, we get the financial support, but we also get the ideas and energy and so forth to lead us forward. Now, I think it's probably pretty critical too to think about what does this all mean? And we've had some of these conversations, which is why don't we just sit back and wait? So the MASA members, the existing membership, has said that, okay, we'll probably bring in new MASA members in the future, but they're not coming in at lower cost. They're going to come in at least what everybody has put in, and if not more, because value will be added over time. So our expectation is, at least within the next year or so, we may allow additional members to join MASA, but that cost of joining will not be at any discount from, in fact, it'll probably be at a premium to where we're currently at. On top of that, a couple of reasons. Why not just wait? Well, potentially the MASA board could decide, the MASA membership could decide to close the membership in MASA and not continue to make it open. That does not mean that might not be code available through MASA in the future, but the code would be at a substantially higher cost than if you were a MASA member. MASA has also worked really interactively with Norm Brown and FBS Systems to think about their future pricing model. FBS, the pricing on FBS software now, if you're a new user and you're coming on and you're starting to add all the different functionality, the economics of being a MASA member are attractive. And that'll continue to develop that way. Also going forward, and we're still in kind of discussions about how this all looks, but the likelihood that pure FBS users some years in the future will have access to a much more limited range of code than if they're a MASA member. The development is going into the MASA side. We still want to make sure that FBS is a good introductory way into the code, into keeping the records, and so we can bring on new operations over time and give them that opportunity. But if you're moving into the more robust, more complex, more heavy data use and analysis, you're going to need to be a MASA member. So this is the Class C. That's those shares that FBS gets, and they're non-voting and they're participating equity only. And so the governance, Class A unit members are the governing body of MASA. They elect board members, which they have done. We are the next first formal MASA meeting is scheduled for, Norm, what's the date? August
19.
August 19 in Moline, Illinois. And the MASA membership will get together. We have Pat Christie from Conservis, who is one of the originators and owners of Conservis, and Robert Levin, who is the head of Rabo North American. Rabo is pretty interested in what MASA is doing on. We've been getting actually some interest from a number of areas, because the access to a really robust general ledger, accounting and control system that can work with a lot of the modern operations is there isn't a whole lot of systems out there that are able to do what FBS currently does, and the MASA process is going to make that more robust going forward. And so we will actually be having some discussions at that meeting. We had a first round, which is the $25,000, set to expire August 15th, and we have decided, since the meeting's not until the 19th, the board will have to confirm this, but we're going to see if we can extend that through that meeting on the 19th, so that potentially people who would want to become a MASA member could attend that meeting as an interested party on the. They wouldn't have any voting rights, but they could see who's doing, what's going on, and they could start to get an understanding of where MASA's headed. And that meeting is on Monday in Moline, and we will probably announce some kind of registration for that, which will probably be handled by FBS. So that's kind of, you heard that here first. That's just now, we just kind of thought about doing that. So that's kind of what I've got to share with you. What other questions would you have? Mickey? And I can tell you who the board members are if you don't know. Let me go back here. So Blake Hollis of Lane Havens is on the board. Brian Watkins of Watkins Farms, he owns a software application called Cropzilla, is a member. Jonah Howard Casey from JC Howard Farms is on the board. I'm on the board. Norm's on the board. Randy Gangwish of Gangwish Seed Farms, who actually, Randy's got a lot of experience. He was chairman of NC Plus Hybrids at one point. Who else? Who am I missing? Joe Dykes Farms in Michigan's on the board.